for webinar number 176 in the Andean Health Organization, Hipólito Unanue Agreement, starting the webinar series in May 2020, years now of continuous interlearning. In the projection of the Andean Health Organization, there are concepts loaded with content that mark our daily work and that act consistently with the ideas we defend. Among them, two indissoluble pairs. The first is health and well-being. We cannot conceive of health except in its relationship with all the areas that make up life in society and in nature. The second, social and environmental justice. The earth is a home of all beings, and it is only in harmony, respect, and care for the Mother Earth that humanity will be able to reach the balance to live well. Other key concepts, critical epidemiology and health sovereignty, we will discuss in this seminar. Reflections on these and other relevant priorities for health and well-being can be found in the monthly Noti Salud Andinas Bulletin, available on the Andean Health Organization webpage. We invite you to leave your name, organization, and country in the comment box of the Facebook Live or YouTube Live chat. In the same space, you can leave your questions or send them via email to webinarhorasconju@gmail.com. In this webinar, we will follow the usual dynamics. We will start with the institutional greeting, followed by the lectures of our speakers, and then we will move on to the Q&A session. To access the certificate of attendance, as usual, in any of the chats, Facebook Live or YouTube Live, you will find a fixed link where you must fill out a brief survey and leave your data as email. Please verify that your email is correctly written or send in the certificate, which will be sent in the coming days to your mails. To begin this important day, I give the floor to Dr. Gloria Lagos, Manager of Strategic Lines and International Cooperation of the Andean Health Organization, who will give the welcome and institutional greeting. Go ahead, dear Dr. Gloria. Thank you very much. My greetings to all of you. I'm Gloria Lagos. As Bertita has indicated, I'm representing Dr. Maria del Carmen Calle, Executive Secretary on the Andean Health Organization, Hipólito Unanue Agreement, who's not with us today because she's traveling. The Andean Health Organization, Hipólito Unanue Agreement, was established by decision of the Ministers of Health of Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Venezuela in December 1971. On December 18 of 2022, we will celebrate 52 years of uninterrupted work with the vision of making significant progress in the effective exercise of the right to health of the population. In the Andean Health Organization, we promote the exchange of experience in the framework of regional integration based on the work of 31 Andean committees, subcommittees, working groups, the network of communicators, and the Andean Intersectorial Roundtable for Coordination Against Health Inequalities, all of which are made up of delegates from the Ministries of Health of the 6 Andean countries. In addition, we consider the cooperation of partners organizations to be essential to achieve the proposed objective. Since May 2020, we have been holding weekly webinars to promote continuous and constant interlearning. As a sample of this, today, Thursday, June 1st, we will hold webinar number 176, which aims to present the book Critical Epidemiology of SARS-CoV-2 in Latin America and the Caribbean. A warm welcome to all. We are coordinating this webinar with the Working Group of International Health and Health Sovereignty of the Latin American Council of Social Sciences, CLACSO. This is a leading research and training group in Latin America, which promotes cooperation networks for the generation of knowledge, research, and in this case, dissemination of Latin America critical thinking in health. The book presented today by our guest has been produced with the purpose of contributing to the critical analysis and to problematize the epidemiological processes and the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. You will be able to corroborate in the book there is a necessary critical stance on what was done during the COVID-19 pandemic in many of our countries. But this is not to be sad by the limitations or mistakes made, but to learn from these limitations and above all, to not repeat them. Precisely for this reason, in this event, we urge you to analyze what structural changes in policies, in the economy, in academia, work, in daily life should we make to better prevent diseases, future outbreaks, and epidemics, and to achieve a society that cares for life with social and environmental justice for the welfare of all. Welcome, Dr. Oscar Feo. It's a pleasure of having you in this your house. Dr. Gonzalo Basile, Dr. Lenny Prat. Thank you so much for being here with us. Welcome to all the people who are joining us today. Thank you. Thank you very much, dear Dr. Gloria. Excellent opening words, quite motivating. And after this greeting of the manager of cooperation and lines in the Andean Health Organization, introduce myself. My name is Bertaluz Pineda, sociologist, coordinator of climate change and inequalities in the Andean Health Organization, and today I will be gladly in charge of moderating this webinar. After this preamble, we extend a warm welcome to Dr. Oscar Feo, physician, Venezuelan sanitarist, teaching researcher at the University of Carabobo and the Institute of High Studies Arnoldo Gabal, Venezuela. Guest lecturer at university, congress, and seminars throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. He is currently a member of the International Health Working Group of the Latin American Council of Social Sciences. He was founder of the Latin American Association of Social Medicine. He was a consultant of the Pan American Health Organization, was executive secretary of the Andean Health Organization, Equality to Non-Agreement, and a member of the management team of the South American Institute of Government in Health of UNASUR. Go ahead, dear Dr. Oscar, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Bertaluz. Thank you very much to the Andean Health Organization, to Dr. Calle, Gloria, for this space, not only to present a book, but also to share some insights of what the pandemic brought us. Well, the pandemic brought us this webinar, that we are here. It brought us this book and the conviction that the epidemiology that we do in our countries is insufficient, and that in some way is the core of my presentation at this moment. Because of the connectivity difficulties that we have in Venezuela, I sent my pre-recorded presentation, but I will be here for the discussion and to listen to the webinar. So I would like to ask Berta so we can start with my presentation. Hello, greetings to everyone. It is a pleasure to be sharing with you the Andean Health Organization. Can you hear me?
No, Bertita, hemos perdido el audio.
Se paró. Si cierra tu micrófono, continúa la presentación.
Sí.
Saludo a su...
Greetings.
Hola.
Hello. Greetings to everyone. It's a pleasure to be sharing once again with the Andean Health Organization. Health, my greetings to the Executive Secretary, Dr. Mari Carmen and Bertaluz. Thank you so much for the organization of this seminar. So now let's go to introduce our book called Critical Epidemiology of SARS-CoV-2 in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's a book produced by the International Health and Health Sovereignty Working Group of CLACSO. Here we have Lenny and Gonzalo participated in this event, and they are part of the coordinators of this working group that have more than 100 researchers from the entire Latin American region and the Caribbean region who develop an intense effort of teaching and research in this region. This book is a product of a collective research and construction work that starts from an analysis matrix for the critical approach of the pandemic. And let me share with you this matrix because I consider that it may be interesting for analysis. In first place, we are proposing an epidemiological characterization of the pandemic and other similar respiratory diseases. Secondly, socio-political dynamics of the society in the face of the pandemic are analyzed. Third, the socio-political dynamics of the state in the response to the pandemic emergency. Fourth, the health system responses. And number 5, we have a comparative analysis of the health measures taken by the ministries of health. In 6th place, a Northern Global Health Security Geopolitics and the relationship with regional integration and international health. And finally, we see the pandemic from the perspective proposed with the shock doctrine and disaster capital. The book is organized in 2 parts. The first part on epistemic and political conceptual aspects, where we focus on the critical epidemiology and its application to pandemic analysis. We have 2 articles with Gonzalo Basile that propose the basis on which we build, upon which the analysis of the pandemic from the perspective of critical epidemiology, and with about the 3 Ds, determination, dependence, and coordination in the epidemiological response. A third article with Gonzalo, we've called Chronicle of an Foretold Geopolitics, the Global Pharmaceutical Financial Architecture in Vaccine Governance. In addition, in the second part, in this book, we have 9 case studies from 9 countries: in Argentina, El Salvador, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, from Spain, an interesting contribution, Bolivia, who has a different moment during the pandemic because of the government changes in this article called Conjecture of the COVID-19 Pandemic, Two Moments, Two Approaches to Policies, and experience in Brazil about the impact of the pandemic on the Black and indigenous population. From Chile, the pandemic and disbanding of the neoliberal model, and from Paraguay, the public policies and strategies of social resistance. This is the structure of the book that we invite you to download from the Claxo webpage. We will provide more detailed information later on of how we can have the digital version of this book. I will have to summarize in 3 ideas. The core of this publication, I will say that the most important idea are the inadequacies of classic epidemiology and traditional public health, and the failure of health system and international organizations to explain and address the pandemic. Many of the articles and the political conceptual part emphasize that epidemiology and public health that we have are not sufficient to explain and deal with the pandemic in the population. And in addition, we emphasize, and we see clear cases of countries where the proposing the incapacity of health systems and the lack of capacity of the international organizations. That's the first idea. We need a new epidemiology that we call critical epidemiology, a new public health that we call a refoundation of the health system from a different perspective to the reforms that have been promoted and a new perspectives of the international organizations to explain and deal and face and take health and disease of the population and the process that need to deal with these problems of so much migrations and pandemics associated to climate change. A second idea that the government of the pandemic, the conduction of the responses to the pandemic were in the hands of big capital, and in particular of the pharmaceutical industry. The major pharmaceutical industry influence on international organizations and committees that were in charge of facing the pandemic, and we can say that they colonized WHO. So the pandemic government was not in WHO, was in the hands of big capital that determined what were the responses to be offered. And then the pandemic became a business space, and the big capital and the pharmaceutical industry convert the pandemic in a business opportunity. And we see how there are many studies that show that in the 3 years of pandemic, 90% of the population impoverished, 10% got rich, and that 10% are mostly the pharmaceutical industry, the biotechnology industry, the industrial medical complex. Some tips to communicate ideas that are present in this book. Well, the origin of the pandemic was a clear transfer from nature to society, which must be read or understood in terms of society, nature, metabolism. We see the social metabolism, how the environmental problems have broken the harmony of society with nature, and only under that perspective we will understand this zoonotic from a virus that circulates for thousands of years among animals, but suddenly transferred to the human. We also have some highlights in these years of pandemic. Collective panic that was generated and linked to what Klein indicated in the shock twin. Big capital needs fear, and this in order to control them using elements that, as we're going to see, and the social and protection and deepening of inequalities determined by class, ethnicity, or gender. The fragility of health systems affected by the market and the privatizing reforms that could not provide a response to the pandemic, and very important, the predominance of a reductionist epidemiology based on isolated case counts and deaths, but disconnected from territories and lifestyles, and with no possibility of proposing the relations of social determination around this pandemic. So, in order to understand the pandemic crisis, it is essential to have a new categorical framework. We need to deconstruct and dismantle the prevalent Eurocentric and Pan-American epidemiological framework, and we need to seek to build another categorical framework which leads us to rethink the depth of the epidemiological health response in the territories, such as we see with the pandemic or the climate change that we've seen in recent years. Another idea was that a false expectation was created that the vaccine is a definitive solution. We, from the critical thought in health, we say that the vaccination is necessary, but insufficient, because the pandemic is just one expression of the profound civilizational crisis that threatens life on the planet. And WHO was been recently announced that we can have new pandemics, and of course they can come. We can have new natural disasters. We can have thousands of processes that will affect life and health because they are linked to the rupture of the balance between society and nature, of that social metabolism, which is generating a good portion of disasters that are threatening humankind and are threatening the planet. Now I will go to the second part, comment about vaccines, articles, chronicle of a geopolitics foretold. And this article has a purpose to characterize the pharmaceutical complex and its role in driving the response to the pandemic, and to demonstrate how the response to the pandemic is determined by the big pharma's interest, in particular, demonstrate the influence that that large pharmaceutical industry, what they call big pharma, had on COVAX, which determined its poor role, that this institution that was organized to guarantee access to vaccines on the South had a very poor performance. We would intend to demonstrate that the global pharmaceutical complex colonized WHO and governed the research, development, validation, production, sale, and distribution of SARS-CoV-2 vaccines. 80% of the budget of WHO depends on donations, which are concentrated in a few countries, the Gates Foundations, and the pharmaceutical industry. Gavi is not governed by WHO, but also by the World Bank and the Gates Foundation with global pharmaceutical industry participation guarantee 60% of its funding and therefore are the ones who establish the agenda and these are part of the new world of liberal global health. A crucial observation that we think that should be considered is that the medical industrial complex is a web of pharmaceutical corporations on one hand, and on the other hand, large financial groups and are related to vulture funds. So it is difficult to make distinction between public and private when describing the global pharmaceutical complex, because the global north and the financial groups and the pharmaceutical corporations are coordinating among themselves. Today, this complex is a geopolitical expression that shows a permanent coordination between states and corporations. There is no separation between state and pharmaceutical corporations. They are intrinsically linked. One of the first things that COVAX did was to secure patients' rights under a market logic, which expressed the influence of pharmaceutical companies in the states of the global north in the governance of access to vaccines. One of the first things that WHO and COVAX should do the release of patents. South Africa and India submitted a proposal to free vaccines for patents in order to have mass production, and it could reach to the countries of the South. And that proposal received the support of more than 100 countries, but was blocked by the US and the EU and a small number of countries, which express the interest of the large medical, industrial, financial, pharmaceutical complex. So in the patents, one of the fundamental strategies to guarantee many years of earnings and more earnings. Well, another element that we think that is important to point out when we talk about vaccines and is proposed in the book is the existence of a corporate biomedical academy with a multi-dollar budget that commoditizes knowledge. Moderna is a clear example of that multi-billion-dollar corporate biomedical science that trades with knowledge and receives 2.5 billion for public funds for vaccine, which allows major earnings to the shareholders. And pharmaceutical corporations are intertwined with financial groups and states of the global north. The philanthrocapitalism and the big pharma industry took advantage of the pandemic to do business and increase their profit. And to conclude, we need another form of thinking and acting in health. We need a new categorical framework to understand the world and understand climate change and understand the pandemic, to understand the production and distribution of vaccines. We need the raptor, an epistemic, methodological, and geopolitical raptor, and that can only be achieved with critical thinking in health, from collective health and from critical epidemiology. To conclude, I think that there is a demand that vaccines can no longer be governed by WTO and its trade rules, which turns vaccines into commodities. From critical thinking in health, we call for a massive strengthening of health policy action to achieve timely and universal access to vaccines as a fundamental social public good for the care of collective health of the people, part of the right to health. We need to make vaccines of what they are commodities today to public social goods with universal access. This is a call, fundamental call that I think that we need to make and to continue doing. Well, with this, I conclude. Thank you so much for your attention. And what we wanted was to give some tips to promote and incentivize the reading of this book, a mechanism that allow us to reflect on how we face the pandemic, but above all, to allow us to correct the mistakes that so frequently we make. Thank you very much. Go ahead. Thank you, dear Dr. Oscar. Well, Bertaluz, that's it. Thank you. Excellent, dear Dr. Oscar. We thank you for this excellent presentation. I would like to comment some ideas in the sense of this call that he had to build a new categorical framework of critical Latin American thinking. Collective health and critical epidemiology are extremely important, and also the call, the request that vaccines are a public good. I was a student of health sovereignty and public health, and I would like to remind you that in one of the classes he emphasized about key aspects of critical epidemiology, and epidemiology that studies health, disease, and especially the unequal distribution among the population in relation to the social systems, consumption, and lifestyles. In this regard, the basic categories of critical epidemiology are determination, reproduction, and social metabolism. This publication of critical epidemiology reminds us, as you mentioned in one of your classes, that the fundamental causes of the poor health are in a society that produces inequalities. In the Annual Health Organization, we are working to reduce inequalities in health. We have the Andean Roundtable for fighting against inequalities, and we are working in the analysis and Andean policy. Once again, thank you very much for your excellent lecture. We have many questions. Please stay in the room, and at the end of the presentation, we will have a Q&A discussion. Now we would like to welcome Dr. Lenny Kret. She has a degree in psychology from the Federal University of Bahia. She holds a PhD in social and health sciences from the University of Barcelona, and his postdoctorate in anthropology at the Universitat Lumière in Lyon and at the Department of Black and Latino Studies at Baruch College in the US. He is currently a full professor at the Institute of Collective Health, where she has served as director since August 2009. Dr. Lenny Trad is also a member of the Brazilian Association of Collective Health and works mainly in the areas of ethnicity and humanization of health. In the Institute, she is also coordinator of the FASA Research and Technical Cooperation Group, Community, Family, and Health. She is a member of the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences in Brazil and is coordinator of the International Health and Health Sovereignty Working Group of the Latin American Council of Social Sciences. She is a researcher of the National Research Council. Go ahead, dear Dr. Lenny, you have the floor. Thank you very much. I'm not the director of the Institute. There's been a typo. Everything else is correct, but perhaps there was some small typo. But thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you to the Andean Health Organization and to my colleagues from this group, to Gonzalo and Oscar, who are also the organizer and also co-authors of chapters in this book. The truth is that Oscar has said much of what we can say about this work, and especially that everything that we have learned or are learning with the pandemic and with the process of the drafting of this document. And I'm going to share with you a specific chapter, which is the second part of the book, that talks about the 9 case studies, and I'm going to talk about the case of Brazil. So I understand that you're going to start with the slides. Thank you. This is a title, so you're going to understand. Can we see the next slide, please? Can you move on, please? From Oscar's presentation, when we see the analysis matrix, which has been a common base for all of us who have worked in this book, I can say that for the case in Brazil, we have worked on point number 1 with this epidemiological characterization of the pandemic, and also number 3 with regard to the social political dynamics of the state in the response to the epidemic emergency, and then the health system's response. From these 3 elements, but the other aspects have also been considered in the chapter on Brazil. Next, please. This is the group of authors who participated in a very active way. Clarice Mota, Diana Anunciación, as well as Clarice, part of the group. Diana Anunciación is from the Federal University. Can you go back one slide, please? And Diana Anunciación from the Federal University of Bahia. Please, we have the next slide. Next slide. Okay. Sara Mota, Carlos Alberto Santos de Pablo, and Jamie Lopez from Colombia. She's been living with us for a long time in Brazil. She's part of the FASA program. In this chapter, we have looked at the 3 ends. Maybe we have some difficulty with the file. Perhaps I could do it myself. Yes, that's better.
Ahora. Sí, espero que esté bien. Yo le sugiero, doctora, que por favor siga, así lo estamos viendo.
Please go ahead, doctor.
Ahora sí ve. Sí, ¿se ve bien? Nación indígena brasileña. Pero ahora aparece también el Oscar. el video. Bueno,
there's a video.
vamos. Las tres N's que
The
llamamos
three
aquí,
N's that here
es
in Spanish
negación,
we call
negligencia y
denial, neglect,
necropolítica.
and necropolitics.
Y entonces,
So
en este capítulo vamos
in this chapter,
a demostrar
we are going to demonstrate how these three elements,
la negligencia, la negación y
neglect,
sobre todo
denial, and
necropolítica,
necropolitics,
iniciamos en esta compleja cartografía
we
territorial
enter in
brasileña,
this complex Brazilian territorial mapping,
sobre dos
especially
grupos
focus
poblacionales,
on the
la
two
población
population
black
groups,
y la
the
población
Black
indígena.
and the indigenous populations from
A su
Brazil.
vez, las tres N's,
Also, the three
guardan
N's
conexión clara
have a
con el
connection
sello de
with the
identidad
three
mencionado
D's
Oscar.
mentioned by Oscar, which are
Una base común también
a
en la
common
discusión
basis
de
in
este
the
libro y
discussion
producción
of
de este
this
libro.
book and the generation of this book.
Determinación, en nuestro caso,
Determination,
hablamos de la
we
determinación
talk about
social.
social determination,
Dependencia, quizás
dependence,
aparezca con menos
perhaps
y
this
muy
is less
fuertemente
emphasis,
descoordinación en
and
la respuesta epidemiológica.
uncoordination,
Luego,
strong uncoordination in epidemiological response.
otra vez sale el video. El video.
There is a video.
Nosotros no estamos escuchando el video. Dele la siguiente lámina, doctora.
Perdona, estamos escuchando el video. No sé
I
qué
can listen
Eso usted lo escucha.
to the
nosotros
video, but we're not listening to the video.
sí.
I can barely hear you.
Adelante, pase a la
que no
siguiente lámina.
consigo presentar escuchando el video.
I cannot
Deme un
give
minuto.
my lecture if I'm listening to this
Ahora
video.
sí se paró. A ver si consigo seguir. Bueno, no, sigue. No sé qué pasa, pero para mí está el video de Oscar.
I have Oscar's video with me.
Sí, ya lo voy a pasar yo. Disculpe, doctora. Ya mismo le voy a pasar.
Just give us a minute here, please.
Porque cuando todo el tiempo viene el video y entonces no consigo presentarlo.
Yo le quité la grabación que había. Ya. Mire, ahí lo ve bien. Estamos
Sí.
en producción de negligencia, ¿sí?
We are in.
No, estamos antes.
No, we need to go back.
Sigue igual con el video. No sé qué
I can
pasa,
still
pero
hear
para
to
mí está
the video,
el audio.
the audio.
No sé qué pasa.
Deme un minuto, tranquila, ya voy a quitar el video.
Give me a minute and I'll
Doctora, tal vez
fix
fue
this.
porque copió alguna lámina de una presentación pregrabada del doctor Oscar y ahí por el video
Maybe you
fue
copy one of
pero
the
tranquila que ya
Dr. Oscar's
Puedo sacar.
presentation
Bueno, no hay
slides.
problema porque puedo sacar. Es esta. A lo mejor hago esto.
Okay, now
Voy a
I'll try to
escribir
fix.
pronto. Creo que con esto ya.
I think that by
solamente
deleting
vamos a
this
ver.
slide, we've solved the problem.
Déjame ver.
Let me see.
Ah, sí, ahora que has dicho, quizás sea por esto.
Now, perhaps that was the reason.
pero ahí todavía se ve la grabación. Hay que quitar la grabación. Deme un minuto.
Pero ¿cómo la quito?
Just give me a minute.
He quitado ya el slide. Ahora no sé qué hago.
Continúe, por favor, en la lámina donde estaba.
Please continue with the
Nosotros no
slide
estamos escuchando la grabación.
because we cannot hear
Voy a intentar
the
porque
audio.
no,
I'll give it a try.
no consigo conseguir porque si escucho yo no hay cómo seguir. No consigo hablar escuchando al mismo.
I cannot speak and hear at the same time. Could you close your
A ver qué hago aquí porque ya estoy, que no sé.
screen share?
¿Cuál es la propuesta?
Close your file. Berta Luz will share your presentation so you can see the screen.
Ya he cerrado todo lo que tenía aquí. Ya está. ¿Qué pasa aquí? Hay uno que no quiere cerrar. A ver si consigo. Qué raro. No sé.
¿Está viendo mi presentación, doctora?
Sí, sí, bueno.
Can you see my presentation, Dr. Lenny?
La lámina es la 5, si no me equivoco.
But it's slide number 5,
No la
please.
voy a poner modo presentación porque se escucha el video, la grabación.
I'm going to leave it like this.
Bueno,
Otherwise, we will be listening to the recording.
Perdona por todo esto, pero no.
My apologies for all this
Problema.
problem.
Enfim, vamos a apresentar un poquito de
So now
panorama
we're
más
going
general
to share some
que
of
está
the
marcado por descoordinación y negligencia. Entonces, de la parte del
incoordination and
gobierno
negligence.
brasileño,
In terms of the
esto
Brazilian
se
state's
observó
response,
una
what we
política
observed
gubernamental
was a
desastrosa
disastrous
para el
government
país.
policy to address the
Todas las
pandemic,
áreas estratégicas
verified in all
pero
strategic
una
areas,
falta
but
significativa
most
en el área de salud.
significantly
Una
in
vez
the area of
más,
health.
una ausencia de un
And
plan
there was an
nacional
absence of an
específico para
effective
enfrentar la
national plan to
pandemia,
address the
articulado con
pandemic
estados y municipios.
coordinated with states and municipalities.
En el contexto de la respuesta
And in the
del
context
sistema
of the
de
health
salud,
system's
es
response,
importante de marcar
it is
porque
important to
el sistema único de salud de
indicate
Brasil,
because the
desde
public
su
health
creación
system in Brazil,
inicial en
since its
años
creation
pasados,
and in
ha sido
recent years,
considerado un sistema de
has been
salud
considered
modelo, ejemplar
an
para el mundo.
exemplary model for the world.
Desde los últimos,
But
después del impeachment, después del
after the
golpe
impeachment
que
and
sacó a Dilma Rousseff,
the
ha empezado un
military
proceso
coup,
de desmonte de
we
este sistema.
saw
A
a
partir
dismantling
de
of this
Bolsonaro,
system.
la cosa se
And in the
empezó a
Bolsonaro
complicar.
government, this got
Cortes en
even worse.
presupuestos,
Budget
privatización de
cuts,
la atención
privatization of
especializada,
specialized
en
care,
especial sectores de diagnósticos y
in
hospitalarios.
diagnostic and
Los
hospital
recortes
sectors,
sistemáticos en la atención
systematic
primaria
cuts in
y un
primary
cambio
care,
significativo
and
en
a
los
significant change
fundamentos de la atención primaria de
in
Brasil,
the
que también
basis
desde una
of primary
perspectiva
care in
considerada
Brazil,
avanzada,
who
en
had
nombre de una
a
eficiencia preconizada
advanced
por la lógica del
perspective,
capital y del mercado. Y en este punto, en mi
and
visión,
it was
está
changed in the
completamente
name of
coherente con lo que
efficiency
consideramos
advocated by the
también
logic of
cientos.
capital in the market.
Cuando hablamos de
When we talk
determinación,
about
estamos hablando de determinación
social
social en el
determination
contexto de la
in the
pandemia,
context
del
of the
contexto de la
pandemic and
pandemia
in
en
the
Brasil,
context
no
of the
es posible
Brazilian
hablar de
pandemic,
ello sin
we have
hacer
to
referencia al
make
racismo estructural.
referral to the
En la primera
structural
ola del SARS-CoV-2,
racism. In the first wave of
el ritmo
SARS-CoV-2,
progresivo de
there was a
contagio y
progressive rate of
mortalidad
COVID-19 infection and
proporcional
mortality
entre los pobres,
among the
negros,
poor,
en Brasil esto es
blacks,
un
indigenous,
cataclismo. Si son negros, son
and
pobres.
other vulnerable populations. In
Indígenas
Brazil, if they are black, they
son
are poor.
vulnerables. El acceso restringido
The
de poblaciones
restricted
negras y
access
indígenas
of black and
ha
indigenous
generalizado
population to basic
las
sanitation,
dificultades para adherirse
the
a las medidas
difficulties to adhere to
preventivas de
preventive measures
aislamiento
of isolation and social
social, las
distancing,
barreras
the
geográficas,
geographical,
culturales
economic,
para
and
acceder
cultural
a
barriers
servicios
to
de salud
access health
son parte
services
de este
are part
panorama,
of
de
this
este proceso
landscape and
social
this process
en Brasil
that
desde
started in Brazil
el proceso de colonización.
since the
La
process of
pandemia
colonization.
profundizó y
The
profundizó
pandemic
un contexto
reflected and deepened
histórico
an
de
historical
inequidad
context
social
of social and
y
health
salud,
inequity,
resultado de la
the
combinación del
result of a
racismo
combination
colonial
of
con los
colonial
índices de
heritage,
fraude sistémico
structural and
que ha
systemic
explicado
racism,
Francisco, que creo, y proyectos
and
neoliberales
development
de salud.
projects
El próximo.
anchored in neoliberal capitalism.
Así que tenemos como
So
conceptos
we
claves.
have some key concepts.
Conceptos claves, racismo estructural, sin duda.
Have structural
Uno de los
racism
determinantes de
is
este
one of the
proceso que
determinants of
ha
this
dado
process
la pandemia en Brasil y que
with the
grupos
pandemic in
están
Brazil
en una
and
condición de mayor
what
vulnerabilidad,
groups were in great or
considerando las
vulnerability,
intersecciones de determinados
considering the
marcadores
intersection
sociales
of
con la
certain social
evolución de
markers
clases
with
sociales.
emphasis on race, class, and gender.
Entendiendo este racismo
And
como el
we understand
proceso
this
en el cual
racism of the
grupos
process
en los ámbitos
in
de la
which
política, la economía y las relaciones cotidianas, condiciones de subalternidad y
the
privilegios que se
conditions
distribuyen entre los grupos
are
raciales.
distributed among racial
Francisco
groups.
Almeida, que hoy es
Today,
nuestro actual ministro de
the
Derechos
current
Humanos.
Ministry of Human Rights.
El otro concepto clave es
The other key
necrofeminismo.
consulting
La
is
segregación
necropolitics. The epidemiological social-spatial segregation had observed also had features of necropolitics in territories and territorialities of the region, like in the Caribbean. How can we define this? Talk about necropolitics is to understand how the government has the ability to define who matters and who doesn't, who is disposable and who is not, which is legitimize itself to do so through narrative about the value and usefulness of people to society. Finally, to this concept, we add the production of negligence. This is different to speaking of disease and negligence. We're talking about a process that links social invisibility, a result of the non-recognition of a situation or disease as a health problem, inaction, which is the absence of actions to respond or act in the face of the problem. Finally, the incompetence in planning and execution of action. But the most important of this concept is that it is not about neglected diseases, but about people, populations, territories, entire communities ignored through complex political and social processes. Therefore, ignored in their plan of public policies, ignored in the prioritization of investments and others. In this context of the pandemic, two groups were identified with this idea of production of negligence. The Quilombola communities, part of the Black population and indigenous populations. But not only the Quilombolas, but other groups of Blacks were strongly affected. Next. As part of this process of uncoordination and misinformation, in the case of Brazil, we were surprised with the data blackout. During the first year, there were many controversies with regards to the numbers of the pandemic. The under-registration was the rule. After the first death by SARS-CoV-2, the federal government issued a provisionary measure that restricted the Access to Information Act, which is considered basis for transparency of information in Latin Brazil and also a democracy. Stay like that until the Federal Supreme Court suspended the effectiveness of this measure as abusive and in violation of the principle of publicity and transparency. But despite that, there was some time until the field race color, although it appears in the forms of the health system, was incorporated as a category of analysis for the epidemiological situation of COVID-19. This was achieved after much pressure from social movements and organizations in Brazil. But the absence of this field has contributed to make the death associated invisible in terms of race. Some epidemiological data. The first wave in July 2020, people of brown and black race color accounted 59% of all deaths and 54% of hospitalization by COVID-19, including records with no information or with this field ignored were 30%. From January 2021, we saw a reversal of the trend. There was an accelerated increase in the number of cases, especially in the South and Southeast regions, because this region in Brazil have, especially in the south, the white population is majority. Hypothesis that there was a massive support of the negationist thesis for former President Bolsonaro in these white majority regions. Not talking specifically about the Black population in the context of the pandemic, first we must say, how do we express racial segregation in Brazil? Black populations are in the majority of territories with worse living conditions, limited access to good schools, job opportunities, and quality health services, and with few chances for social mobility. In the context of the pandemic, as it has been said, especially in the first wave, high contamination and case fatality rates by SARS-CoV-2 in this Black population. And we have to remember that workers who were forced to continue working, domestic port workers, security guards, general service workers, public transport and application drivers, public security agents, and many others. Most of them are Black. And also the housing conditions. I can read. Thank you. Housing conditions and lack of resources preventing them from adopting adequate projective measures. I don't know if the word is sarcasm, but we talk about social distances in houses where we have 3 families living in one household, or to talk about hand washing and adequate hand washing where there's no drinking water or no access to bathrooms. So there are a lot of contradictions with what was promoted as preventive measures and what was offered from the point of view of living conditions for the more vulnerable populations. And in this Black population, as I mentioned, we were interested in the situation of the Quilombola. In a more general description, the Quilombolas are descendants from communities made from slaves, but in this decree that recognizes this population is defined as an ethnic racial group with their own historical trajectory, endowed with specific territorial relations, with a presumption of Black ancestry related to the resistance to historical oppression suffered. Brazil has an estimate of 5,972 Quilombola localities divided into 1,672 Brazilian municipalities. We need to indicate that since the Bolsonaro government went into office, there hasn't been any recognition of the new Quilombola territories. It is important to indicate that historically, Quilombola populations have been excluded from the National Development Project and equally from the comprehensive health care advocated by SUS. And these are certain populations as a consequence of agribusiness, tourism projects, mining, among other processes that impact their life and health. With regards to the pandemic, much of what has been said about the Black population in general has increased in many aspects in the context of communities. And this is because, in general, this population has many difficulties in access to health services. In general, they also have the worst health indicators, and with the pandemic, the situation became more serious, and there was a record number of deaths of quilombolas with the pandemic. Regarding the Brazilian indigenous population, the comments with regards to some characteristics of this population. There's an immense ethno-cultural heterogeneity expressed in 305 ethnic groups and 274 languages distributed throughout the Brazilian territory, but represent 4% of the general population. It is interesting to talk about the concept of necropolitics when we remember that in 1500, when the Portuguese arrived, there were 3.5 million indigenous that lived in Brazil. Now, in the last census of 2022, we recorded 900,000. So when all the Brazilian population from the other population groups have increased, and Brazil has more than 260 million inhabitants, in the case of indigenous, it's quite the opposite. Second aspect is that there's a complementary care subsystem created to offer quote-unquote comprehensive and differentiated care, in theory sensitive to the socio-cultural specificities of indigenous communities. However, this idea of sensitivity to these populations is not shown in practice. It is estimated that there are 7,103 indigenous localities in Brazilian territories distributed in 828 municipalities. Of these, only 632 result in officially demarcated lands, and that only 2% of these were recognized in the last 10 years. Talk about the pandemics, not in terms of numbers, but some aspects that I think worth mention. New coronavirus arrived Brazil in an acute phase of worsening health conditions of indigenous people and assistance to these populations. It is important to share with you, during the government of Bolsonaro, there was a lot of persecution to indigenous people. The interest of the miners, and the missionaries, and other type of interests made that this population was abandoned in terms of social protection and health care. In 1 year, between 2020 and 2021, the evolution of the disease shows the following pattern. Confirmed cases 1,140 to 54,460, death from 131 to 1,081. 1 year. There are two situations of increased vulnerability with this population in the context of the pandemic. Number one is that indigenous communities exposed to contact of minors and or missionaries who masquerade as religious evangelization interests. This has and worse increased the risk of transmission. And the other group is precisely the isolated group. Although these groups were better protected from contact with other groups, but on the other hand, they were in recent contact with other social groups. And there was no care in health services. I'm almost done. In this context, it is not difficult
evidências de
talk
necropolítica e
about
resistência.
evidence of
No Brasil,
necropolitics and resistance
especialmente lo que ha
in the
pasado,
context of Brazil,
hablando ahora de la
specifically
población indígena.
talking about the
Por
indigenous
ejemplo,
population.
el
For
proyecto de ley
example, the
1142 de 2020 visó
Law Project
implementar
1142 of May 2020
de combate ao
aimed at the
coronavírus para
implementing an emergency plan to combat the coronavirus for indigenous and
Sin
Quilombola
embargo,
populations.
presidente Bolsonaro,
However, President Bolsonaro
17 artículos
vetoed 17 articles of this proposal.
Hubo un plano, hubo
So
un
there
plan,
was a
pero
project,
hubo
but
un veto a 17
there was a
artículos
veto
que
to
incluía
17 articles
acceso
that
al
include
agua
access to
potable,
drinking water,
distribución de
the
productos de
distribution of
higiene y
hygiene products
alimentos,
and
las
food
cestas básicas de
or
alimentos,
basic baskets,
interferindo
interfering with the access
el conjunto de esses artículos, acessos
to
às las unidades de
ICUs,
cuidado intensivo y finalmente
and finally
vetou a
also
inclusão de
veto
raça
the
cor no
inclusion
registro de
of
casos.
race color in the COVID-19 case
Finalmente,
registry.
en 2021,
And
los
in
pueblos indígenas
2021, the
lograron,
indigenous peoples,
junto con el
did
Poder
together
Judicial
with
del
federal
Estado,
judiciary,
imponer al gobierno
posing on the
brasileño la
Brazilian government the
inclusión de los
inclusion
pueblos indígenas
of
como
indigenous people as a
prioridades
priority group,
y también
and also
reconocer
to
a los
recognize
grupos que
groups
residen en tierras
residing in
indígenas y a
indigenous
los grupos que
territories
no han
that
sido
have not
aprobados.
yet been
Y
approved,
finalmente, los
and
indígenas
finally,
que viven
those
en áreas
indigenous
urbanas
living
no
in urban
residentes.
areas.
Bueno, para concluir,
To conclude,
sí. Primero decir, y creo que
we
lo
must
dijo
say
Oscar muy
first,
bien,
as Oscar
la
has very
pandemia
well stated,
no ha creado
the
las
pandemic
situaciones de
has
desigualdad,
not
de inequidades,
created
de
the
vulnerabilidad,
social inequalities
la
and
desigualdad
vulnerability,
social, pero sí
but
ha
has
servido para acentuar las
accentuated
desigualdades.
this inequality
Como resultado del
as a result of
que
neoliberalism,
ya viene minando las
who's
posibilidades
affecting
de construir una sociedad
certain segments of the
sustentada.
population to build
Y este
a society
proceso
with
afecta
social
y
justice,
sigue
and
afectando
this process
ciertos segmentos
has
de la
affected
población más
certain segments of the
expuestos a la
population more
enfermedad.
exposed to
Y en este sentido, los
disease.
números
And in
actuales
this
de
regard,
los
the current
últimos 3
figures
años del
in the
desempleo y
last
del
3 years
empobrecimiento
of
indican
unemployment and impoverishing and death,
como grupos
we
más
see
afectados
are the
exactamente la
most
población
affected
negra,
groups are the Black
la
population
población
as well
indígena.
as the
Y en el
indigenous
caso de
population,
Brasil, las
that in the case of Brazil,
proporciones son muy distintas.
the proportions are
La
quite
población
different.
negra, según
The
el
Black
INEGEL,
population
suma la población autodefinida
includes this
como
population
negra y
self
también
defined as
negra.
Black and brown.
Corresponde, según el censo
Today,
de
according to
2022, al
the 22 census,
56% de la
to
población indígena.
56% of the
En el
Brazilian
caso de la
population.
población indígena,
In the case of
está
the indigenous
comprendido
population,
en torno del
it's
8%.
around
Pero
8%,
cada uno dentro
but
de
each
su
one
participación
in their
ha sido expresamente
participation
afectada por la
has been
pandemia.
affected
Es
differently by
decir,
the
que
pandemic.
en la ausencia de la
Important to
actuación
say that in
efectiva,
the absence of an effective
fueron
state
los
action,
conocimientos
it
ancestrales
was
de
the
espiritualidad,
ancestral
de
knowledge,
la
spirituality,
solidaridad
courage,
y la unión
solidarity, and the inter and
intracomunidades
intra-community
fueron
unity were the
estrategias
main
adoptadas
strategies
por la
adopted
población indígena
by the
y
indigenous
quilombola
and
para
Quilombola
sobrevivir a la
population
pandemia.
to survive the pandemic.
Finalmente, es
Finally,
necesario que se
it
diga
is
que el
important to
racismo
mention
no
that
terminó
racism is not an
históricamente,
historical
es una
remnant.
sociedad que
It's a
sigue a
societal
buscar la
project that has
formación de la
always
sociedad
underpinned
brasileña.
the
Su
formation of Brazilian
manifestación a
society.
través de
It
dispositivos
manifests
subjetivos
itself
y
through
objetivos,
subjective and
frutos de
objective
una mentalidad
devices
colonialista, esclavista y
generated by a
meritocrática, basada
colonialist,
en un ideal
slave-owning, and meritocratic
neoliberal de
mentality
una
based on
sociedad
a neoliberal
exclusiva.
ideal of an
Muchas
exclusive
gracias,
society.
mil
Thank you
disculpas
very
por el
much, and I apologize for all the technical issues
resumido y tal,
with
pero
the
espero
audio and the slide, but I hope
tenga
that
comprendido, ¿no?
you
Porque
understood my
mi
presentation
idioma es el portugués, así
because
que
I speak
hablo el español,
Portuguese,
pero siempre
I
con un
speak
acento
Spanish, but I always have an
algunas
accent
palabras a lo mejor
and some words perhaps
no están correctas, pero
are
muchas
not
gracias.
correct, but thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, querida doctora
Thank you,
Leni.
dear Dr. Lenny.
Muy interesante la presentación
Very
de este
interesting
capítulo
presentation of
de
this
la
chapter
situación de
of the
Brasil
situation in
en el
Brazil
campo de las respuestas que se
in terms of the response to the pandemic, you showed many issues, the lack of coordination, the neglect at the beginning, among many other problems, and also from the perspective of social determination of health. As you have indicated, accentuated existing problems such as structural racism, well, inequality, makes them larger. Inequalities kill. That's the title of one of the books of a sociologist who works on this. Inequalities kill. And these multiple inequalities, there are also opportunities to build equality, and this is one of the major challenges that we need to make progress in building relationships that are more democratic, with politics and structural transformation to build more fair societies. Excellent presentation, congratulations, and we ask you to please stay in the room, and then we'll Q&A. We would like to welcome Dr. Lovasile. He's an epidemiologist and social scientist with a master's degree in epidemiology and postgraduate studies in public health and epidemiology in international health at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, postgraduate in health economics and policies at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He's currently the director and the principal investigator of the International Health Program of the Latin American Faculty of Social Science in the Dominican Republic. He's the coordinator of the Working Group on International Health and Health Sovereignty of the Latin American Council of Social Sciences, CLACSO. Professor of several master's and doctoral programs in public health at universities in Latin America and the Caribbean. Dear Gonzalo, you have the word. Go ahead, please. Good morning to everyone and region. I would like to thank the Andean Health Organization with Bert and the whole team and Carmen for their interest in help with dissemination and the use of this book that was a study. Perhaps at some point I'm going to use a PowerPoint, but to put it in context, as Professor Oscar did it, part of this matrix of analysis was designed 99% the first 2 months of the pandemic. One of the values that this publication has, that right from the start, the CLACSO group study working group were started to consider a number of questions, not only about global governance of the pandemic, but of each particular government who had their epidemic in each one of our countries and territories, and trying to analyze some critical links that are going to quickly show. So I think that the first invitation to download the book, I've been sharing it with a YouTube chat channel. So this can be distributed and has open access to downloading of this book, is to value this collective effort that we did building a critical analysis matrix. We said at the definition, at the start of the presentation, with a number of categories that allowed us for these 2 years to generate first dialogues, discussion, and critical discussion group during the first year of the pandemic in our territories and countries. And for the second year, we start analyzing the geopolitics that were involved in how the power relationships have spatial projections in the field of health. So I will quickly pose you with the first challenge of how this book proposes to study the pandemic and the SARS-CoV-2 epidemics. What you're going to see here is not only a classical analysis of public diseases or numerology or counting rates or distribution, deaths, morbidity on SARS-CoV-2. It's not a book that, it's not also a book that tries to link these inequality studies, as we call it sometimes. In, we did not, in this book, we have a different look to consider this in terms of inequality, and with the Anglo-Saxon models, thinking inequality as an event of economic development with GDP measures and other ways of measuring health inequalities, or more recently, by measuring inequalities of well-being, but also considers the development theories and look at the health inequities by ethnias or social classes and have a more complex consideration of these determinations. So the first exercise that this book proposes is to not only apply this critical analysis matrix with the 3Ds, the D of international determination, social determination, the flows of international determinations, the D of dependence, how our theoretical frameworks and methodological frameworks in epidemiology and public health in the 21st centuries reproduce knowledge matrix with a lot of colon. And the third D, that being in a conference of horas, which is more interest, which is the regional lack of coordination or incoordination. This critical matrix is trying to place these 3Ds of critical epidemiology and thought for and from Latin America and the Caribbean. Matrix is not a total matrix that can be used universally in every context, territory, societies, or continent, but we like to consider the conceptual, theoretical, methodological challenges or practical challenges that we had to think, to observe the impact and the logics that the epidemiological knowledge that we use and how we face with copy and paste in our regional dynamic in the global south, but in particular in Latin America and the Caribbean. You're going to see that much of this publication opens more questions than answers, care, and perhaps to detect some alert. So what do we mean to import all the dynamic of global sanitary safety? Or what do we mean by make the public health as a biology process in the 21st century? What do we mean by all these experimental processes trying to consider their complexity? How can we give to our Latin American and Caribbean health thinking, we can provide them complexity bodies for contingency? So these are always knowledge that are incomplete, but also with multidimensional bodies to see that complexity in the different dimensions. So the first thing that I'm gonna try to show, we did it before, is this is the presentation of the book. This is where I'm going to stop. This is the matrix of critical links. This is a matrix that we start publishing at the start of 2020 with first articles in some journals, or in the first journals that we used was the Abrasco Health and Science Journal and other journals, where we start to ask ourselves, well, if there are some critical links, that means that they were coordinating and connected, and how there was a set of at least 4 critical links where there was an entire field of understanding and study. And these 4 critical links were being the matrix of understanding, the theoretical matrix, but also a matrix that was not only theoretical, but we saw it in our lives, the practical matrix, because all the knowledge field accumulated in logic practices for SARS-CoV-2. And in that matrix, we were working on 4 fields that you can see in chapter 1. We were trying to think in geopolitics, referral, the global sanitary safety that was built after the end of the Cold War at the start of the 90s, where it was the end of the Cold War and there was a new conception of how the new pathogens circulation and diseases and epidemiological problems can be a risk for national security of the global north. And in fact, in 2005, there was a first reformulation of what we call International Sanitary Regulation, a profoundly colonial document that we will not be able to discuss them in depth, because most of them come from the relations between trade and control of diseases and colonization, that somehow is going to transform on the basis of this regulation. But that updating of the regulation included a concept of global sanitary safety that's going to be present until today. And it was not only present in SARS-CoV-2, it had already been present in the Ebola crisis. You always need to read the dynamics of quarantine and the African traditional medicine and all these dynamics involved in terms of how African public services were fragile, where they were having all the privatizations. And so it's a set of dynamics of militarization that are response to the Ebola. And what I'm trying to say is that what we saw in SARS-CoV-2 in our situation rooms of our governments was a matrix that had already been reproduced in crisis in Thailand and Africa on respiratory diseases, something that has been started to see with the Zika virus in the Latin America and the Caribbean, and with the militarization and everything else. But these are the 4 components. The second one has to do with epidemiology and public health. What type of epidemiology and public health we have reproduced during the pandemic? The instruments, many to that instrument, what we call population experimental trials. Many experts of biomedicine showed us many experimental trials with a sort of a body of scientific evidence. In many cases were under discussion, and in those experimental trials, we updated the policies and the concept of medical police of the 19th century, of the Latin American, the Caribbean, of transferring all our plans and logics to control and prevent infections in public facilities, which are necessary and efficient measures to control infections in health facilities with viruses, to transfer this to the everyday life of the society. cleaning surfaces, a number of dynamics for control of infection, and finally, a hybrid shock that we call the institutional arrangements to our health system. So what I mean is our social systems were fragmented and had some structural limitation due to the reforms of the IBD and the IMF and with PAHO, and we found in a situation where any excess demand will produce a collapse. The system has lost their ability to prevent and promote in society and in their territories and at their community levels, and the systems were fragile in how can they respond, but to those health systems, we inserted in real time a sort of hormonal growth with more beds, more respirators, more inputs and health technologies to respond to what we can call the epidemiological blackout, like a parachute. A parachuter came to this epidemiological fire, pulls it away, and destroys many things, putting out this fire and some capacities that we had, although fragile. For example, women's health, mother and child health, and everything was paralyzed because of this hybrid shock. So in that dynamic, we propose to look at three elements. Element of the D of determination considers we to understand this general dimension that we need to recover to look at global epidemiological problems or problems of global policies or international determination of health. What seeking is a new way or a new dimension of complexity and to change our observation scale of how we are looking the conditionings and for a healthy life in the South. So that category of international determination that we need to quickly discuss, and that category of international determination allows us to go here. We use that category to understand a COVID modeling of international determination. How in this modeling there were international determination in the response to SARS-CoV-2 with more geopolitical dynamics, and we have three of them. The geopolitical of development, the geopolitical of the nature, society, metabolism, and then how those three condition a geopolitic of how we consider science and work, and how that geopolitic generates dependence, but also the global chain values, not only in vaccines, but also with inputs and health technology. And a third geopolitics had to do with global inequality. Those three geopolitics that we try to describe as international determination of what was done on SARS-CoV-2 allow us to see these three things. Three geopolitics allow us to quickly set up a mapping of complexity of what were the conditionings, adversities, and problems, not only from the theoretical and methodological, but also practical, and at the South to make decisions on these conditionings and adversities. I say this because we usually get upset, and there needs to be some criticism to the managers at the government level and public health for Latin America and the Caribbean. But I think that the exercise that we are trying to do is to see what conditioning and adversities are found in your situation rooms and your decision-making mapping for strategies when you face a global or regional crisis. We have proposed three. The geopolitics of the nature, society, metabolisms, because facing a capitalism that's more accelerated, it's more reproduces in a financial dynamic in very short periods of time, and is more accelerated to destroy nature, as we know in Latin America and the Caribbean, with extractions of what they call raw materials. But in that dynamic of metabolism, what we are doing in general, the global logic is to control and monitor the re-emergent pathogens, and I invite you to look at that with the literature in the North, because this is something built by the CDC in the US with all the logic of national security, with the State Department and the Defense Department to conceptualize those emergent diseases as that South produces pathogens and new diseases that are a risk for us in the North. So we need to put some regulations and monitoring. While they make us build lens in our ways we do traditional surveillance with vertical epidemiology, in which we monitor the populations. At the same moment that we do that, on the other hand, what we say, there was an elephant inside the bazaar. We have an elephant in the room and we don't see it. So there's a nature, society, metabolism present, because all the nature goods are destroyed in the south as compared to the north, and that geopolitics conditions adversity, because with systems, dashboards, and monitoring of pathogenicity and new ways of surveillance of the frequency distribution in cases in the traditional logic of epidemiology, the elephant is still in the room. So we have a crisis of nature, society, metabolisms that's generating epidemiological crisis such as SARS. In second place, we have all our technology dependence. We have a long dependence in the 20th century to a geopolitical of isthmus, in thinking if there is or we have a Latin American and Caribbean thought of our own health. If there's a critical thinking from the Latin American and the Caribbean in terms of public health, and you could ask yourself how much of our public health reproduces the matrix of these isms in the public health, the developism, Pan-Americanism, and has to do with our own generation of knowledge and thinking in terms of health, South and in Latin America. And finally, we have the geopolitics of global sanitary safety. These geopolitics are not neutral. Oscar mentioned, while on one hand, we have the idea that the post-pandemic treaty, and I think that this book can be used for many, put the context to the description of the WHO with the post-pandemic treaty. In the post-pandemic treaty, with the global North academics, they are discussing how much more of global sanitary safety we need to allocate, how much for control of pathogens and safety to this dynamic of the international sanitary regulation. But the same room, we have the elephant. We have a Western WHO worker is financed by institutions from the North and from the US and the global North in general. So when you ask yourself, with what autonomy can our Latin American countries and Caribbean countries and regional organization of public health? How much autonomy and sovereignty we are considering this problem? For example, the post-pandemic treaty. Oscar mentioned of the Gavi and CEPI, Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, and the co-govern the COVAX, to which Oscar already alluded. Once again, the elephant is in the room. So I think that in that dynamic, and I'm going to stop here, these adversities and conditionings are not only theoretical proposals, not only of the group of international or Basile or Leni or Travi or other authors, are a problem that we need for decision making in our situation rooms, both at the epidemiology or with the lens that I'm looking at the epidemiological crisis and sanitary political problems in this region. Number two, the D, I close, the D of determination. The last proposal, the proposal from this publication is proposing in Claxo is to change our analysis unit, our spatial scale for temporal scale. So what I'm proposing here is not only a theoretical discussion, but to change our observation scale for decision making. Go away from the analysis unit brought from the West, when the unit of analysis, the state, nation, and then we have borders, diseases, and deaths, and we study international health under this unit of state, nation, and borders. And move to another analysis unit, change our scale of observation to flow of international health determinations that would allow us to see in our south, in our own maps and decision and situation rooms, what are dependencies that we have, what geopoliticals do I have in order to make decisions in terms of production, health, science, technology, but in terms of autonomy in the public health field. So the change of the unit of analysis, not only a theoretical, but also a practical change. So we have the concept brought by the Pan American Health Organization doctrine. There may be people from PAHO listening. This is not a problem with the technicians. It's a third issue with the doctrine of the Pan American Health Organization. As you know, the Pan American doctrine is a theory created for the terms of international relationships inside the US, and that Pan American doctrine sees us as a subcontinent that, as you know, was created at the end of the 19th century with the birth of the Pan American Health Organization. In the first 60 years, who governs that Pan American Health Organization are the US Navy hospital system. If you look at the first 60 years, the PAHO directors were the heads of the hospital service of the US Navy. Remember the flow of disease, control borders, etc. Now we also have an update with the configuration of global health. I don't have time to describe it. But global health is going to make some changes in their analysis units, making emphasis on the policies of health and the bottom line epidemiology to make an approach on the individual, the individualization of risk, and an approach of how there's a logic of the public-private association may be more effective to respond and measure the challenges of global health, such as like in the space of community. But the problem with the global health, they created a governance global agenda that responds to our needs and problems and priorities. Propose to go to health from the south as a new conception in the study of maps and determinants to build strategies of health sovereignty. So the second D that I already mentioned is the dependence. What epidemiology and public health we've been doing during the pandemic for SARS-CoV-2. And there's a first quick criticism that there were many clinical biomedics, infectious disease and virologists that very quickly became masters or PhD in public health and epidemiology, making decisions in real time and colonizing almost all our expert committees of COVID-19. We reviewed 14 or 15 crisis committees and expert committees in the government of our countries in Latin America, and who were part of those experts in making the recommendations and providing ideas to the President and Minister of Health. And 2/3 of them, almost 70% of the members of these expert committees were clinicians, biomedicals, with all the biomedical knowledge that was needed in terms of a response from the disease. We're making decisions in real time at the level of the society and the population level. First bias, but the second bias is how our public health, I always mention Ecuador, how our public health was governed from this functionalism, structural functionalism. We have public health copied from the north and was created to solve the problems in the dynamics between economics, and we copy a public health that believes that our social systems and our problems are stable and they always produce health balance. And in those balance or equilibrium, when there's any misadjustment, the adjustments are instrumental, that are functional. And this may be an epidemic outbreak. And those misadjustments, we have the toolbox of public health are going to control those misadjustments, to control them or mitigate them. So we have a conception of public health as government under that logic, and the biomedicalization of biology colonized by clinical infectology, calling it epidemiology. We also have a dependence in terms of epidemiology and public health to the global mandate. Those global mandates, you know, those are never neutral. Those global mandates provide us the science that we call canned, like the canned tomato, or what the state has to do and the health system has to do, or that we need to do in this or that program, by copying and pasting global mandates. And that also, to a large extent, in many countries occurred during the pandemic. So we were in a trial and error logic when we copy and paste from the north. You remember the first weeks for Latin America, copying the same slogan, stay at home. You hold your head and say, what am I going to stay in the Latin American and Caribbean territories with chaotic urbanizations and other situations that we have in America. And finally, this technical-political dependencies end up generating impacts on what we do. We describe pharmaceutical epidemiology, the theses that were used in the population experimental trial. I quarantine, I stopped the society to a virus without discussing the quarantine thesis. As you know, we studied it in public health 30 years ago. Quarantine 1, red, yellow, or green quarantine. So quarantines were no longer used. And this assumes something, that the paralysis of mobility is going to produce a paralysis of the process of population disease process. Like the paralysis of the human mobility will paralyze the interaction of society in the 21st century. That was the thesis defended, flattening of the curve. And of course, we had a epidemiological discussion. 2 minutes and I'll be done. And in that epidemiological discussion, we have the use of instruments such as quarantine, punitive surveillance, control that I showed before. And to conclude, there is a part of the book that poses to look at lack of coordination, the voids that we have of regional health sovereignty against the response to SARS-CoV-2. It's not only a criticism. We in chapter make a full discussion of the different regional integration. We have ORAS on one hand, we have COMISCA for Central America, and we have the CARICOM Public Health Agency. We have CLAC and with some health agenda, and we have the Pan-Americanism still active, and we have Mercosur with G11. So there are a lot of regional integration dynamics, but in those dynamics, in a crisis like SARS-2, we found a profound lack of coordination. What I call is a disintegrated sanitary politic regionalism. I'm not criticizing what the regional institutions did in sharing information from the ministries and had situation analysis to share data or try to make things together to consider. What I'm referring here is strategic decision making at the regional level. Brazil decided one thing, Argentina decided another, and in the evaluation of vaccine, Mexico, Chile, or Colombia decide others about borders and opening or closure of borders. So a disintegrated regionalism and SARS show that situation. So what we are proposing in that last point is how to deal with this regional lack of coordination, which is not in the practice, but also of territories, of theoretical lenses. And here we are proposing the sanitary sovereignty strategy, understanding this in the 21st century, that this is a strategy, firstly. It's not a decision of a state or nation by itself, creating a medical productive complex in their borders and making decisions towards their own country. Could you do that and disconnect with one single territory by disconnecting of all the flow of dependency? And so what we are proposing is that this strategy was never considered as such. And I go to my last point, is to go from an understanding of the modern state and nation that we have in our head to a state region. Think for strategies of sanitary policy with regional flows and movements. And in that, you think you're going to understand those of you who are in regional organizations, because you understand what we're talking about and the difficulty that we find in this, because we have technical political training that gives us the tools to administer the borders, the diseases, and we do a regional proposing. At the most, we will only share information, have a small program in common to try to vaccinate, for example. But we're trying to say with health sovereignty, not that all the regions overnight are going to become in integration of the region. That will be, I don't see it practical in the short. I do see practical is two things. One, how our different regions from Latin America and Caribbean start to build flows of health sovereignty to their own subregion, and they start generating meetings of regional strategies. And secondly, understand that sanitary sovereignty is not a decision of the states and the Ministry of Health. This is a strategy that can also be built in the territories and the social movements in the practice of the originary people that has a lot of knowledge of sanitary sovereignty and other groups that are generating programs as such that are perhaps disconnected from the state in the macro political discussion, but produce sovereignty. So with that, I stop. Thank you. Dear Gonzalo, we know that you have many things to say in a book of more than 450 pages that we have summarized in one short event in less than 2 hours. Excellent presentation made when the analysis that you are proposing will basically like to tell everyone who have joined us to read the book. It gives us different analysis perspective. You've heard Gonzalo about the analysis of determination, in this case, the international. We're more familiarized with the social determination, but this is an interesting analysis from this perspective, the dependency and lack of coordination. Thank you for your excellent presentations. We're going to thank all the people who are joining us from the Ministry of Health, academics, and different entities, organizations from Argentina, Belize, Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Cuba, Ecuador, Spain, Guatemala, the UK, Dominican Republic, Mexico, Nicaragua, Paraguay, Peru, Uruguay, Venezuela, among others, many other countries. We also receive many greetings and acknowledgements. Please ask you to activate your video for this Q&A. Very important to mention that we have received many positive comments congratulating you for your presentations. They've asked us for the link of the book, so that's already posted in all of our networks. So there's a lot of interest to read. And as I was saying, we have many questions, and due to time, we're only going to read 3, and I ask you to try to respond in just a few minutes. So we can provide the answers through the YouTube and Facebook later on. They are asking us information about this diploma in management of international policy and health sovereignty, because concepts of what we discussed today are also seen in this diploma course. They are asking what are the lessons that we need to consider as a society to demand the necessary epidemiology. And also there is a problem of emerging or re-emerging diseases, and there's a specific question. Present, our region is suffering dengue outbreaks with large quantities that overwhelm the health systems. And the critical epidemiology, what will be the most important causal factors, and what opportunities we have to strengthen the response from critical epidemiology. So we will start in the order of the presentations. Go ahead, Oscar.
Oscar, tú primero. Adelante, Oscar.
Oscar, you go first.
Dale, Gonzalo.
Go, Gonzalo.
Claro, porque vio preguntas de dengue, Oscar. Por eso.
He tenido un problema, no he conseguido
Y hay que
escuchar.
garantizar, perdón.
I couldn't hear the question.
Están preguntando mucho sobre
They're asking about the link to obtain the book.
Hay que decirle, yo no tengo el enlace
I don't have the direct link. Perhaps
Yo te
Gonzalo
lo
can do it.
compartí.
We
Ya
have
te lo
already shared it,
sí, ya todos lo
Dr.
tienen.
Oscar.
Así es.
Yes.
Dos o tres comentarios.
2 or 3 comments
Planteaba Berta, quizás Oscar
to what Berta mentioned.
también nos puede hacer algunos
Perhaps
comentarios.
Oscar can also
En
comment.
primer lugar, yo creo que para
I
muchos,
think
muchos que
personally
estamos
that for
teniendo
many
por primera vez
who
alguna
are
aproximación a la epidemiología,
having an
estamos
approximation to
en
critical
un
epidemiology
pensamiento dentro de un pensamiento crítico
as
latinoamericano en salud.
a new way of
En primer
considering
lugar, creo
health.
que la epidemiología
First, I
crítica
consider
no
that
solo es
critical
pensamiento
epidemiology is not a
crítico,
change
por
in
decirlo
criticism,
sencillamente, bueno, es hacer crítica
because
a la epidemiología
you don't,
funcional, a la
it's
forma
not
de cómo
just
se hace,
making
pero hacer
criticism to
y
surveillance or
entender la
functional
epidemiología crítica lo
epidemiology,
primero que
but
les
critical
está
epidemiology instead
complejizando
is
son
proposing
un salto, un
to
cambio en
make
las
a leap
escalas de observación,
in the
en
scale
las
of
escalas
observation,
temporales
in
y
the
en las
temporal
unidades de
scales,
análisis.
and in the unit of analysis.
Nosotros en la epidemiología
So
tradicional
we, in traditional
comúnmente
epidemiology,
utilizamos
we use
lugar, persona y
place,
tiempo.
person,
¿No?
and
Es
time.
decir, lugar es
The place,
el sitio donde se
location
produce la
is
enfermedad,
where the
es
disease
la
occurs.
cronología, ¿no?
Time
La
is the
secuencia,
chronology and the
el lugar es la
frequency,
distribución y el
and
caso
the
es
location is the
lo que hacemos
distribution,
como
and the case is
epidemiólogos
what we
por
do
asociación
as
de la
incidence,
población.
prevalence,
Pero acá,
etc.
¿no? Lugar, caso y tiempo, digamos, persona y tiempo. Esas tres categorías
Those
son las
3
categorías
categories,
basales
which are the
de
baseline
la
categories
epidemiología funcional o de la
of
epidemiología.
functional epidemiology or
Si no,
classical
básicamente
epidemiology,
nos genera un primer sesgo,
generates
que
a
es el de
first
ver los
bias, which
eventos
is to see
epidemiológicos, los eventos
the
de salud pública,
epidemiological
como
events
eventos de conteo
as
de
events of
casos y áreas.
counting case,
Es decir,
location, and time,
sino ver qué sesgo está
without
generando
looking
eso,
what's the
cómo eso
bias
nos
with
produce
that,
una reducción en
how
nuestra
that
forma de
makes a
comprender
reduction in
los
our
temas
understanding
epidemiológicos y
of
sanitarios.
the
Esa es la epidemiología
epidemiological
crítica.
and
Lo
health
segundo que está
problems. So
pasando
what the critical
es
epidemiology does
complejizar
first
lugar
is to
en términos de un
make a
salto
complex between
a una escala de
location
observación
towards
diferente.
a different
Tiempo,
observation scale,
territorio,
which is the
o el caso,
territory,
para el
the
caso
community
andino, en toda la
for the
concepción
Andean
andina de la
case.
comunidad, sería cambiar
It will
la
be
escala de
to
observación.
change our observation
Sabemos que
scale,
nuestra
where
escala de observación en la
our
epidemiología
observation
tradicional se
in
mide
traditional
en
epidemiology,
establecimientos de salud, porque
it's
el
measured in
establecimiento es el caso que
because
se va a reportar,
the one
el
who
caso de
gets to
salud
that
pública vertical que
facility
contó casos y contó
that
enfermedades
was
y contó
counting
eventos,
cases and
¿no?
diseases
En
and
la
events.
epidemiología crítica vamos a
In the
ver
critical
una reducción
epidemiology,
en
we're going
términos
to
de
see a
tiempo,
change in the
del
scale of
territorio, de la
observation,
comunidad y la
the territory,
dinámica
the
de eso que
community, and
también
the
mide
dynamics of how that
el dato. Lenny lo va a
makes.
entender desde las ciencias sociales, que el dato no
Lenny
es
is going to
solamente
understand because the data is
cuantitativo,
not only
sino que es un dato
quantitative,
que se complejiza
but
con
it's
el
something that
contexto, con la situación,
becomes
con
complex
el
with the
estilo de vida,
situation,
con
with
la
the life
forma de
modes,
cómo se utilizan
lifestyles, and
técnicas para
I have to
tratar
combine
de entender
techniques to
o
try
aproximarse
to
a ese
understand
contexto y a
to
esa
that
escala de observación
context and that
colectiva.
observation
En
scale that's
segundo
more
lugar, la
collective.
epidemiología
In
tradicional
second place,
plantea,
traditional epidemiology
¿no? De alguna manera,
proposes
el tiempo exclusivamente como una escala
the time
temporal lineal,
as a
¿no? Una
linear
hora,
temporal
día,
scale,
semana,
hour,
y
day, week,
contabilizamos,
month,
acumulamos
and
los
that's how we
casos
count and
que
accrue
entran a los
cases
establecimientos de
that go
salud, que
to
los
health
establecimientos de
facilities,
salud tuvieron
and that health
alguna
facilities
capacidad
had
para
some
reportar y registrar
type of
casos
reporting
y
and
análisis y sistema de información.
registering that
Lo
case
que trato
in
de
an
proponer
information
con el
system.
lugar también y el
What I'm
tiempo
trying to say
es
with
que
time and place
viendo como
is that
sistemas de
what we
información
see
y
as
observamos
information system, what we see
como
in a
sistemas de
situation
información
rooms
son
as information
escalas,
systems are
escalas que
scales.
en este caso son
Scales, and in
escalas
this case
individuales de
are
reporte de
individual
fenómenos
scales of
individuales
reporting
que
individual
terminan divididos en
phenomena
una
that
escala
end up
agrupada,
in
en la
a
que vamos
pooled
agrupando estos
scale
datos
because we're
como
pooling the
los
cases
agrupamos por el establecimiento, después los
by
agrupamos por el barrio, después los agrupamos
by the
por el
facility,
municipio,
by the
después los agrupamos
neighborhood,
por
by
la
the
provincia o el
municipality, and
estado,
then the
después los
province and the
agrupamos por el
state,
país.
and then by
El
country.
dato sigue
But the
siendo de
data is
escala
still
individual en la
from the
escala
individual
temporal
scale
cronológica.
and temporal chronological scale.
El agrupamiento que
So
vamos
the
haciendo en distintas
pooling
escalas es
of
con
the
esa
different
inicial
scales
que hay
is
en el
with that
principio,
initial
¿no?
bias of
Es
the
cambiar
individual.
la dinámica del
Change
tiempo
the dynamic of
por el
time.
proceso,
For a
implica
process
que en algunos
lies
sistemas
that in some
epidemiológicos o
epidemiological
sanitarios
and
tenemos que
political
cambiar
problems,
nuestras escalas
we
temporales.
need to
Es
change our
decir, cuando
temporal
acá mismo,
scales.
es decir, para
That is
entenderlo
when I, to understand in Brazil,
y
racism,
perdón Lenny que use esto, o en el Caribe,
or in the Caribbean, collective health of Black women in the Caribbean. So to understand health and epidemiology in terms of the territories, the Black people, and the health of Black women in the Caribbean, perhaps by temporal scale, cannot go to the data of disease on the Anglo-Saxon logic with frequent distribution and associations of morbidity and mortality by race and by color of the skin. That can give me a little help to understand, but if I look at the temporal scale, I'm going to make it more complex or how our countries created hierarchies from the because of the colonial dynamics in terms of race. So the biomedical clinical thinking was born of controlling populations in Africa and in Latin America. All the genetic biological arsenal comes that way as an example. And the last example is change in the unit of analysis. I will ask, can we do public disease by counting cases, diseases, and death? Are we still explaining society's health, community health, by counting diseases and deaths? We obtain frequencies, associations, to whatever type of design you want, by association or by traditional logics. Now, to think our unit of analysis means to look at lifestyle, collective lifestyles, look at dynamics between the general, the particular, and the singular that is proposed by determination in the case of Latin American critical epidemiology, but also means to see critical links and critical intersections that can be provided by feminism to understand the intersections, not simplify that we do that in what they call intersectionality, but in bringing complexity in trying to understand the link of race according to social class and according to gender in this case. That's what I'm saying like this, verbally and descriptively, has a complexity that makes us understand that the methodological strategies are strategies and critical epidemiology methodologies and strategies that are modeled to be reproduced just a strategy, and the methodological strategies are an approximation. They're always an approximation because Oscar starts counting all the times that we change our matrix of participative monitoring of collective health in the territories in the last 10 years. We changed 10 years our ways of mapping and looking geography and considering the territory. So I try to hope this is useful to discuss dengue and I'll leave Oscar and Lenny to talk.
Bueno, no sé si hablo ahora.
Can I talk now? Can I speak?
Voy a intentar ser bastante breve.
I'm going to try to be brief, and I will take the opportunity. Simplification. I think that what we want is to reject simplification, because there is a trend, as we have seen in traditional public health, of simplifying the understanding of what is complex. This makes invisible what is happening. So if you use fat as a variable, I use it as a variable. If you put it from a perspective, historical perspective, it's useless. So what she's talking about race. We talk about critical thinking in health. They reject to simplification with regards to the understanding of the epidemiological health reality. I have a book from Eloisa Iniguez, who's also a member. She's from Cuba. The title of this book is There's So Many Havanas. I will say the same in Brazil. We have similar things. So many Brazils. There are many Brazils, even in the same
Não é
state.
possível compreender desigualdade social, compreender, neste caso,
It's not possible to understand social inequality. And when we're talking about pandemic, how this disease has affected differently to different groups without considering historical dimensions, sociological dimensions, without considering territory from the perspective that we've learned, from a perspective that coordinates political, economical dimension with conflict interests. So if you use a scheme that includes variables, and that's it, they're going to generate everything except knowledge that is valid, because this is a way of masking the complexity of life. I think that either to understand dengue or the COVID pandemic, what we need is to reject attempts to simplify processes that are complex. And if we analyze from an historical perspective and from a political perspective, we're going to see that power is all over the place. So in addition to consider time, space in its complexity, we need to always have a look who represents power. What groups have more privilege than others? What groups have more possibilities to decide the policy, the investments? So we are vindicating here. We talk about critical thinking in health is a rejection, not only to simplification, but to a type of interested simplification. How much more we reproduce simplifying models, more alienation we're doing, and less opportunity that we have to do about colony process of health, power, knowledge. We want to be more able to receive and accept not only imported models of how to face a pandemic, plus all the social, economic, and health and epidemiological organization of our region. I think it's what we're talking about. Very briefly, Berta, because I know we run out of time. There's a question with regards what can we do, and I would just like to comment that in the center of what we need to do is a decolonization. We need to help to decolonize the international organizations, Pan American Health Organization and the World Health Organization. We have to prevent that the industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and the major interests of the North prevail. It's just been announced the possibility of a new pandemic, and that is true to the extent that we're in the middle of a crisis of the civilization that has broken all the links of the society with nature. And the proposal of WHO is a new pandemic treaty. And if you review this new treaty, it's absolutely colonized by large capital and the pharmaceutical industry. So this needs to be reported, and this should not be the case. And to close my comment, we need to decolonize ourselves. We need to reflect on what we do. We need to reflect on that epidemiology and that public health that we think that it's the only one, the only solution, and we need to reflect and decolonize that public health and epidemiology. So I think that we are on a very difficult task. And we don't have no other way but to continue making progress in this training process under different framework.
Excelentes respuestas.
Excellent
Sabemos
response.
que el tiempo
We know
apremia,
that
sobre todo
we're
cuando
running out of
tenemos un
time,
libro de esta magnitud.
and when we have a
Agradecemos
book as
las
such,
preguntas
we
realizadas.
thank for all the
Vamos a
questions.
responderlas
We were not
todas,
able to
pero
respond
las
all of
tomaremos
them,
en cuenta
but
para
we will
definir
take into
temas en próximos
consideration to
seminarios
define
web.
topics for the
Agradecemos mucho la
following web
participación
seminars, and
de
we
todas
value
las personas
the
participantes.
participation of
Para cerrar
everyone.
este espacio
To
de
close
cierre de
this
preguntas
space
y
of the
respuestas,
Q&A, I
nuestro
will
cada
ask
uno un mensaje final.
to leave us a
Un minuto,
final
por
message
favor.
in 1 minute, please.
No, simplemente un poco retomando esto que último que decía
Just
Oscar y Lenny.
following what Oscar and Lenny
En
mentioned,
primer lugar, invitarnos
first of all, to
a
invite
tratar de descolonizar lo
not only to
establecido,
try to
como le
decolonize
comentara Oscar,
the
sino
establishment,
construir nuestra
but also
propia
to build
epidemiología
our
del tema
own
salud desde cero.
epistemology in
Pensar
health,
que efectivamente
to think that
Latinoamérica y el
indeed Latin
Caribe
America and the
tienen
Caribbean
capacidades de construir
have
una
capacities
propia
of building
capacidad
their own
epistémico-político-sanitaria
epistemic
que se llama salud desde el sur,
political
una
health that we
soberanía
call
sanitaria como una nueva
health
forma
from the
de
south
actualizar el
as a
modelo
new way
científico
of
latinoamericano.
updating the Latin American
Muchas
critical
cosas del
thinking.
encuentro entre las ciencias sociales
Not
y las ciencias
only
de la
the
salud
encounter
que nos
between
trajo
social
la
science and
sociología
health science
antropocéntrica del
that
norte,
were
sino
brought
que
from the
ahora
north,
tenemos que adicionar un
but we
tercer
need to
campo de
add a
intervención crítica,
third
que es el
field of critical
desprensamiento
intervention,
decolonial que está
which is
hablando
the
Oscar, no
decolonized
tanto para
thinking,
criticar o para
not to criticize
descolonizar
or decolonize
instituciones,
those
sino para
institutions,
construir nuestras propias
but to build
capacidades
our
de toma
own
de decisiones,
capacities and
quizás
decision
hasta
makings,
nuestra propia integración
hopefully
regional para
our
la
own
soberanía.
regional integration for health sovereignty.
Bueno, quizás dos palabras, rupturas
Two
y
words,
construcción. Romper con la
construction, to
perspectiva
break
eurocéntrica
with the
y
Eurocentric
construir
perspective and
bases
to
que están
build the
en
bases that
nuestras
are
tradiciones,
in our
historias y
traditions,
capacidades de
histories,
base.
and capacities, because we do have them.
Muy bien, gracias, doctor
Thank
Oscar.
you, Dr. Oscar.
Doctor Oscar, su mensaje final.
Oh,
Él tenía dificultades con la
yeah,
conexión, nos había dicho.
he's no longer with
Nosotros
us.
reiteramos el
We
agradecimiento
like
por
to
estas
thank
magníficas
for these
conferencias.
wonderful presentations.
Recibimos muchas
We
felicitaciones
have
de nuestra
received
parte.
many
Muchas gracias, doctor
congratulations.
Oscar, doctora
Thank you,
Leni,
Dr. Oscar,
doctor
Dr.
Gonzalo,
Leni, and
todos
Dr.
los
Gonzalo,
participantes,
to
a todas
all
las
the
personas y a
participants, to
todas
the
las
ORAS
personas que
team, and to all
participan en
the
esta
people who
actividad que ha sido
participate in this
posible
activity, which has
gracias al
been possible
compromiso de
thanks
la
to the
cooperación
commitment with the Andean
Nos vamos con tres
and Latin
manifestaciones
American
que
integration.
reiteramos. La
We have very
lectura
three
de este libro como una
present
importante tarea
reading this
en el
book as
manejo
an
crítico
important
del
task of
SARS-CoV-2
the
en
critical
América.
epidemiology of SARS-CoV-2 in Latin America. Also would like to remind you
En nuestros
the ideas that we
boletines,
share
en
in
nuestras
our
presentaciones,
newsletter in the
ayudándonos a
recent
comprender,
editions. Take care of our Mother Earth, heals every one of us.
muchas
Trust
personas
science.
expresaron
Many
interés
people
en el
express
diploma
interest in
superior en
this
gestión de
superior
epidemias
diploma in
sanitario nacional y soberanía.
management and policies of
Les
international
invitamos a
health and
todas las
sanitary
personas
sovereignty. There's the
interesadas
link
y
for those of you who are
reiteramos nuestra
interested.
más cordial
We would like to
invitación al
invite you
siguiente
to
webinar,
that next
donde
seminar
presentaremos el
where we're
sexto
going to
informe del
show
Grupo
the
Intergubernamental
sixth
sobre
report
el Cambio
of the
Climático para
Intergovernmental Group of
conmemorar el
Climate
Día
Change to commemorate
Mundial
the
del Medio Ambiente.
Environment
El
World Day.
mensaje final y
For the
cierre,
final
le doy la
message and
palabra,
closing,
por favor, a la doctora Gloria
Dr.
Lagos,
Gloria Lagos has the floor,
gerente de líneas estratégicas y cooperación
the manager
internacional
of
en el
strategic lines and
Organización de las
international
Naciones
cooperation
Unidas.
in the Andean Health
Muchísimas gracias,
Organization.
Bertita,
Thank you, Berta,
invitarme nuevamente a
for
esta
inviting
actividad.
me
Yo quiero, en
to
nombre de
address.
la
I
doctora
would like,
María
on
Carmen
behalf of Dr.
Calle,
María Carmen
hacerle
Calle,
llegar su más cordial saludo y su
to
felicitación por esta
transmit
presentación que
their
tiene la
greetings
excelente
and
seguridad
congratulations for their
me consta
presentations.
que ha logrado ver
This has been a
los
great
audios
success
y las
of this
felicitaciones que
webinar,
se han brindado
following all the
para
comments made
todos
in
los
the social media.
participantes de este webinar. Entonces,
So,
además de hacerles llegar
in addition
su
to the
agradecimiento
greetings
por
and
su
thanks
participación,
for your
quiero
participation,
señalar que este webinar nos
just to
deja un
indicate that this
compromiso
webinar
con
leaves
la
us a commitment to continue
constitución de bases
working in
para
building the
generar
basis
acceso a
that will make us close the gaps
medicina que
for health of the Andean population that are more than 8 million, and also to strengthen the compliance or the activities that will contribute to compliance with the right to quality and timely health. A big hug for all of you. A big hug for all of you who follow us week after week. Berta, do the invitation for the next webinar. Thank you. The most a pleasure for us to invite you to the next webinar for the report of climate change on June 8th at 11 a.m. Peruvian Lima time. You're all cordially invited. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias, un abrazo. Chau, chau.
Gracias.
Gracias, Berta, por todo.
Gracias. Muchas gracias.